Hey, Stephen here, Coping with COVID, Power Video Podcast, powerful guest and a powerful message. And man, do we have a powerful guest today. Joining me all the way from around the world is Mr. Nathan McCree. Today's guest is a renowned composer and sound effects editor who has worked on many hit video games, live events, shows, and orchestral projects, and who's also served as audio director for multiple companies, in addition to heading his own music and sound design company in Brno, Czech Republic since 1998. Nathan, go ahead and tell us a little bit about how you're doing and a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Well, I started in the industry in 1993, straight out of university, originally as a computer programmer. My degree was in computer software engineering. So I applied to as many software houses as I could in the area. I was in Derby at the time, and that was in the UK. And I only got one favourable response from about 200 letters that I sent out. And that just happened to be from Core Design, who I actually knew nothing about at all. They invited me for an interview, so I went there. And the moment I walked into the building, into the reception, I could see all these, pictures, framed pictures on the walls. A lot of them were sort of cartoon characters, this kind of thing. And I was looking around and trying to work out what it is that they did. And eventually I thought and asked the lady, I said, do you guys make computer games? And she said, yes, that's right, we do. And I thought, yes, my luck's in, because I was a gamer at the time. I loved computer games, been playing them for years with my brother, all the time we've grown up. So, I had the interview and that was successful. And I started work as a programmer there, initially coding music sequence for the Mega Drive, the Genesis machine. And I finished that a little bit ahead of schedule. So I wrote some music on it to demonstrate how it worked. And the boss really liked it and said, did I want to do the music for their next game? So of course I said yes. And that was it. I had a job change overnight and I became one of their 2 in-house music composers and sound designers for the next 6 years. And a few years later, of course, Tomb Raider came along at that company, and I ended up writing the score for that. So yeah, it was all just a stroke of luck, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you did the music and the sound design for the first 3 Tomb Raider games.
Yeah.
And specifically with Tomb Raider 3, I think that you were, at that point, you were a consultant, or were you still directly working for Core Design?
So when the project started, I was still fully employed. I was still their in-house composer and designer. But I had been wanting to leave the company already for about half a year. And so just at the time when I was about to start work on Tomb Raider 3, I negotiated to leave the company and do the project as a freelance contract. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened. So I basically wrote all the music and did all the video sequences, etc. I did that from my house in Derby, just down the road. But I was still going into the company fairly frequently to kind of look at, the latest build of the game and this kind of thing. So I was still kind of there a lot, but just, working in my studio from home. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I know that you're still doing today. So that kind of continued, and we'll get into that. But I have to ask you specifically about, the first 3 Tomb Raider games are the games of my childhood, some of my favorite games ever. And the soundtrack, that once I knew it was like you were the man behind the soundtrack. I'm like, man, this is like one of my favorite, if not my favorite, composers. And it's very, the music itself, especially like the main themes, are very classical inspired, and the way they're written too. But Tomb Raider 3 specifically has been renowned and known, you know, certainly at the time and in the, you know, the years following its release, was known as one of the best sounding games to date. And what can you share about maybe what went into the Tomb Raider soundtrack, especially for Tomb Raider 3, that made it so so powerful and so realistic sounding and just so memorable?
So, you know, I was obviously learning from the games I'd done previously, Tomb Raider 1 and 2. You know, things that we didn't do in Tomb Raider 1, I managed to do in Tomb Raider 2, and things that I didn't manage to do in Tomb Raider 2, I managed to do in Tomb Raider 3. So each time the music system which we were developing was getting more intelligent and more capable. You know, we were adding functionality to the logic on the music triggers. So, for instance, in Tomb Raider 1, you know, the way we triggered the music was simply just drawing or if you like, marking squares on the floor. And when Lara walked over the squares that were marked, it would start a piece of music. In Tomb Raider 2, it was making decisions. So if Lara had already stepped on that trigger once, don't play it. Things like this. So we weren't getting just repeating triggers happening, you know, so we were starting to kind of cure some of the clunkiness from Tomb Raider 1.
Right.
So it started to kind of think a little bit about what had happened previously and thus make decisions as to whether it should play tunes or not. And Tomb Raider 3, instead of just Lara being able to trigger pieces of music by walking over these marked squares, baddies could trigger pieces of music as well. So this started to, you know, this added another level of complexity where, you know, you could be in a room, you could trigger a baddie, and he would be walking around until actually walk the trigger, perhaps in your line of sight or something like this, and suddenly, dun, 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 you know, it would start, and you'd be like, oh, you know. So again, we were kind of trying to make the whole interactive movie, because that's really what we were trying to make times with Tomb Raider, was this interactive movie. We were trying to kind of make that happen. So, you know, it didn't matter necessarily where you were as the player of Lara Croft. You know, things would be happening independent of where you were and what you were doing. And the game wasn't the same each time you played it, because it depended on what the baddie did. It depended on his logic according to where you were as to where he moved and whether he triggered something. You know, so it was never the same game twice when you played it. Some things were the same. Some things were predictable, some of the puzzles and some of the entry points for baddies, but some things were never the same. So that's one sort of side to it. I think from a musical standpoint, I was learning that long cues, which I'd written for Tomb Raider 1, things like 2 minutes, 2.5 minute tunes, were actually less usable than shorter tunes that were, say, 20 seconds or even 15 seconds. And the music was, you know, less versatile in Tomb Raider 1 compared to Tomb Raider 3. You know, I could use these little snippets that I'd written in Tomb Raider 3 much more, in many more different places. I could kind of sprinkle them across the layer, across the levels much more. The tunes were more reusable in a way, because they were describing tiny little moments instead of some grand golden sphinx where you stood at it for 2 minutes and just listened to a piece of music. You know, we kind of, I was morphing away from that. I still had a few special tunes. There were still, you know, a few special moments where, you know, I had a bit of a longer tune, but in general, the tunes were getting shorter and more of them. So for instance, Tomb Raider 1, I had something like 7 or 8 tunes, maybe 9, I think 9. In Tomb Raider 2, there was about 35, and in Tomb Raider 3, there was about 63. if my memory is spot on.
So you had more to work with at that point.
So exactly. So you got more tunes, but there wasn't necessarily a longer duration in total of the music. A little bit more, but it was basically just everything was much shorter. So I had a greater variety of little snippets to choose from.
Right.
So so that kind of kept the interest musically, and it kind of enabled me to kind of describe what was going on a little bit better with Tomb Raider 3.
Right.
I could be more detailed with the musical descriptions, you know what I mean? So that was a kind of big change from Tomb Raider 1. Sound effects wise, we were also improving the system with that. In Tomb Raider 1, apart from the actual spot sound effects, you know, that are attached to her feet and guns and all this kind of thing, we had a lot of space in Tomb Raider 1 because there wasn't actually very much music. There was only about 20 minutes, maybe even less. And it's like, well, how do you sound a computer game when you've got 20 minutes of music, when the game can last several weeks playtime? You know, so what are we going to do? And there wasn't time to write any more music. I only had about 3 weeks. So it's like, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fill these gaps? We can't just have nothing. We can't just have our footsteps running around for hours and hours and hours. It'd be dreadfully boring. So we thought, well, in between the music, to have some kind of ambient just going, some kind of, you know, because in the real world there's always some sound, unless it's in the real dead of night, but even a cricket or two somewhere, you know, to break silence. So, you know, there's always something going on, even if it's just a gentle wind or some leaves rustling or...
And that's the background.
Right. These are, you know, we call them ambient.
Ambient.
So, you know, what I did was, you know, I had to think about where she was and then create sounds that would match that environment. So, for instance, when she's first in the... I mean, an obvious example is, you know, if she's by the coast, you would make the sound of the sea. Okay, so some wind and the sea, and you just have a looping sound of that going on, and oh, it would sound like you're by the seaside. When she was in the caves, obviously there's not very much sound in the caves. You got things like dripping water, you know, but then it's like, well, those caves didn't really look like dripping water. I mean, most of it was frozen in Tomb Raider 1. So it's like, well, what sound are we going to have in here? So this is where a bit of artistic license came into play.
Yes, I know exactly. Yep.
I just thought, well, let's just make some spooky sounds. It's like, that makes you go, what's that? You know, what's that noise? Is that a baddie? Is that an animal? Should I get my guns out? What?
Right.
You know. So it was just designed to just spook you out a little bit. And they're not really realistic sounds either. They're kind of bits of metal banging or scraping, and then reversed cymbals. Yes,
yeah. But yet, somehow, when you hear that, and that the caves ambient track has been a track that you've sort of modified and improved on throughout all 3 of the games.
That's correct.
And I remember in the first Tomb Raider, it was very much in the background, and by the third one, but there were it had a pitch to it. Some of the effects had an actual pitch to it, and it was very atmospheric, very atmospheric. And one of my favorite ambient tracks that you did for the game, and I don't even know where the sounds came from, but it was used, a version of it was used in Tomb Raider 2 and Tomb Raider 3, and I would call this the supernatural environment. Right, so floating in Temple of Xi'an, floating islands.
Yeah, the floating islands.
Of Tinos.
Yeah.
Very, very creepy. And in fact, that might be, you know, I would put that up there with, you know, in terms of like just that sound itself to create the atmosphere. Video games usually don't frightened me. But that sound, kind of was like, you could put that up there for like Doom 3 to me, like something that really like spooked me out, just that sound alone. And I don't even know that if that was all synthesized or if that had actual samples in there of something.
Right, if I can remember correctly, it was from a sound effects CD. We buy these sound effects libraries, so you buy 10,000 sounds on a box set of 20 CDs or whatever. And then all the sounds on there are license free, copyright free, so you can just use them for whatever purpose. Film directors use them, obviously games producers, etc. So we buy loads of this stuff, and that sound, particularly for that level, Floating Islands, I think it was the sound of a London Underground tube in London, right? And I'd put it through an AM modulator, an amplitude modulator.
Okay.
So you get this, you get kind of the same note droning through it, but you've got the increase and the decrease of the train coming closer and going away again. But of course, it doesn't sound like a train. It just sounds like...
Right.
You get this kind of weird effect. And, a lot of the time with stuff like that, it's just playing with sounds, and effects processors. And you're just trying to make it as weird as possible. So you're literally pushing sliders and twisting knobs to their maximum. You're just trying to make that machine do its extreme thing. And when it goes really bonkers and crazy, then you sort of turn it down a bit and you just make it a little bit gentle and, perhaps pull the volume down.
Right.
But underneath, the machine is going, it's just screaming and going mental. Yeah, so you kind of make it go mental and balance it into the environment that you're in, and try and kind of freak people out, make them go, what the hell is that? That's all it is.
I worked on a song myself on an album I put out years ago, and in the song was I sampled it was a tornado siren that was going off in the area, but I actually, instead of running to the basement like you're supposed to, I'm like, no, I'm getting my microphone, because the siren was, unlike when they test it and they shoot off one at a time, it made like a nice harmony with a second siren that was going off. I sampled it, and I looped it, and I processed it a little bit, and it became like a backing sound that was backing to the song. So that's something you can do with not just ambient, but with music, certainly experimental music, but really with many kinds of music. Now, I see right now you're at your home studio. I can tell by the padding in the background. So you've had a home studio for a long time, since working on Tomb Raider 3. And I imagine that, because my question for you is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic changed your work? But because you have a home studio, I'm not sure that it would change it that much.
Well, you can probably hear in the background my kids making a noise. There's one of them now. That was the change, because the kids were at home and not at school. We had to be teacher, my wife and I. So she did most of it, but sometimes, if she was busy cooking or something, I'd have to take over and have to come down and do maths or English or whatever for an hour or two. So it did use up my time during the day. So I found myself only actually being able to work for, half a day each day. And, the normal things that we would take for granted, like, just being able to pop to the shops, suddenly the kids have got to go with us because they're at home. So all 5 of us have got to go. So now it's a real big mission, and everyone's got to wear masks. And sometimes we weren't all allowed in the shop at the same time. So only one of us could go in. The rest of us had to stay in the car. So, me and 3 small kids in a car when it's, hot outside for about an hour while mum does the shopping, that's a challenge. So yeah, you know, our lives were affected by it for sure. You know, we couldn't go to the places where we would normally go to as a family. You know, open air swimming pools and stuff like that were closed for the early part of the summer. Yeah, so it was a challenge to kind of manage the family and my day job. That was what was difficult. Just finding the hours really for the day job was tricky. But as far as the kind of work goes, you know, in the games industry, I didn't really notice a difference. I didn't notice a slowdown with the industry at all. You know, gamers, the game coders, etc., and the dev companies kept on deving. You know, whether they were all just working from home, I think probably a bit of that happened. I think, you know, across the studios, but it didn't affect my workload or anything I was doing.
That's interesting. So it was even when you do work from home, this situation that we're all in, that is what this show is all about, coping with, it still can change, and that's very interesting. How has the COVID situation been in the Czech Republic?
Well, not as bad as say the UK or Spain or Italy. We have a slightly less population density here, so it didn't really spread as fast across the nation. I think we had a total of, so far, just less than 20,000 cases and less than 400 deaths in total. And we're only getting now about 1 death a day. Compare that to the States, for instance, they've got 1,500 deaths a day. We've only had a total of less than 400. So, you know, it's a big difference. But you know, many more people. And like I say, I think, you know, compared to the UK, see, the UK is just crammed full of people. There's loads of people in a tiny little space. So of course the virus passes from person to person really easily. You know, you can't get away from people like you can over here.
No, and well, and I didn't know that we would need, going back to what we were talking about, I didn't know that you would need something like the, you know, the T-Rex theme just when you encounter another person. That I feel like I had there was a guy who unfortunately had to have somebody come and fix the something in the bathroom, fix the sink in the bathroom, and it was like he came earlier than expected, you know. And so I feel like I heard, you know, one of those short Tomb Raider 3 you don't want to be awkward and be like, you know, you're wearing a exactly. I'm pretty sure I heard one of those. But the situation is still, you know, still pretty bad here, and it, you know, I don't know there if they did school from home. It sounds like last time. I don't know if are they still doing that?
Well, you know, they opened the schools again only in kind of like the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks of July. But of course, then beginning of August. Earlier than that, isn't it? Because over here they have 2 months. They have July and August. So it was like the last 2 or 3 weeks of June, they opened the schools again, but it wasn't compulsory. You could opt to not send your kids there. Okay. So we thought, to be safe than sorry, we kept our kids at home. And then, of course, everyone broke up for the summer holidays, which we're still in now. So, you know, the kids have been on holiday effectively since, you know, February of this year.
Right. Okay.
We've been at home all that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in the U.S., a lot of the districts were doing, some of them are doing in person, some of them are doing in person, what's called hybrid, where it's less time, either through less hours every day or less days. You know, sometimes they have, you know, some days remote or some hours remote. We were going to do something like that, but we switched to remote start. The districts around me, at least, have mostly switched to fully remote, at least to start, at least until Labor Day. Some have called the first quarter because cases are on the rise again. And so it's something that's here to, more or less stay, unfortunately, at least for our future. And I found that, in teaching music appreciation last year, which that was interesting to teach remotely, but in teaching music appreciation, I've covered many different units, many different artists. I've covered your music. That's how I connected with you. I also did a segment on music therapy or even just coping through music, which can be a very powerful tactic to mitigate anxiety, stress, things like that.
Yeah.
Would you say that yourself, that music has been a coping strategy for you, either composing and or listening?
Well,
besides your career, of course.
It does help me de-stress, but I wouldn't say it was a calculated approach to cope. I'm not the kind of person that has difficulty coping with anything, really. My outlook on life is whatever the problem is, you'll find a way through it. That's kind of what humans do. We're good at that. So I don't worry about what's going to happen or how am I going to handle this? No, I don't kind of do that. Having said that, when I'm writing music, I am not thinking about anything else at all. I'm only thinking about the music that I'm doing. So if I had any issues or concerns, of which I don't really have many, I wouldn't be thinking about those when I'm writing music. I'm not worrying about anything, because I'm just not thinking about anything else. I'm just focusing on the music. So it is a real form of escapism for me. And I'm very lucky that, my career has ended up doing that, because it's something that I absolutely love doing. And when I am doing it, time doesn't exist. It just, I'm in my little bubble, and a few hours later, I get hungry or thirsty, or I get something to eat. Oh, blimey, it's the end of the day.
Right.
And I've no idea how much time has gone by. So.
Right. And that kind of ties into, I'm glad you said that, because that kind of ties into another, some consider it a coping strategy altogether, which is really remaining fully present with what you're doing. So music can do that as well. It's not just the idea of, music in itself. I've seen things on how listening can be therapeutic. I've even seen things about, I've even seen a session where it was about actually composing the music in a therapeutic manner, but it also just can help you be really present. And
Absolutely.
I think that's probably why, why you've had so much success. There's one of the reasons, other than your talents, of course, is because you're able to really get mentally locked in to what you're doing. If you were to say, what would you say are some of the works that you're most proud of, at least to date, of your career?
Well, one of the, I guess one of them that I'm really proud of was one of the first major orchestral projects I did, which was Soul Star on the Mega CD, because the designer of the game, I remember he came down to, because I was working in a cellar at the time in core design. He came down and he said, "Nathan, we're doing this new game, Soul Star, and we want some music for it." I said, "Okay, what kind of thing do you want?" He said, "Well, we want some John Williams Star Wars music." I'm like, "Yeah, okay." That's going to be a tough act to follow, But I thought, well, let's try it, So I listened to a few things. I remember listening to music for Alien and Aliens. I was quite into that movie at the time, and just started to kind of pick apart the orchestrations and what instruments they used, and just started to kind of, I listened to Stravinsky quite a bit, because he kind of pioneered a lot of the stuff that Holst went on to write in The Planets, and then of course John Williams and many other composers have used influences, from Holst to write their sort of, battle music. And then here I am kind of taking my influences from John Williams and Holst and Stravinsky, and so it goes on. You kind of build on, on what do they call it? Standing on the shoulders of giants. It's a bit like that, you're kind of building on the success of other people.
Right.
And so, you listen to all that stuff and then you start doing your thing, and little bits of them come out in what you write. It's not, it's not stealing or anything like that, or plagiarizing or anything like that. It's you're just you're kind of using similar techniques. You kind of listen to how they do things, how they make a shock or a big jump, or how they increase your heart rate, and it's like, all right, that's interesting. So you kind of do, let's make the strings do something similar, let's try and make them agitated like he's doing it, and then you add in your own ingredients that then shapes the piece of music and makes it yours. And I've always tried to do something that I haven't heard before. If I've heard it before, I scrap it. I don't like that. I don't like to sound exactly like somebody else. I always try and find something new. And Soulstar was that. It had a mixture of orchestral instruments and synthesizer instruments. And it was quite melodic. So, like Stravinsky, I wouldn't say his music is melodic. Holst has a bit more melody in there, but his stuff is far more advanced than anything I would write. Those guys have trained and the tools. I've done all of that, so I'm kind of just experimenting most of the time, and I just play around until I find something I like. So Soulstar, in the end, it turned out to be something that I really enjoyed. I liked the melodies that I'd written. I liked the harmonic progressions. I liked playing around with the orchestrations and the mix of the orchestral instruments and the synthesizer sounds. And the whole thing was synchronized to the action that was happening in the game, literally second by second, each wave attack. I'd written, or rather I'd talked to the designer about when everything happened, and then I wrote each piece of music to describe those attack waves. So it was all synchronized. So I was quite pleased with it in the end. It was like 60 minutes of film score, really, in a way. And that was kind of like my first major orchestral work. So that's probably the one I was most proud of. It was a real achievement for me, that. Emotionally, I think Heimdall 2 was and it's still quite I'm still quite attached to that, because I remember when my dad heard that, he said to me, he said, "Oh, that's really great." He said, "I really love that." He said, "I wasn't sure to begin with whether you could do this, but now I've heard Heimdall 2, I am convinced that you can write music." He said, "It's really, really great." And I've never forgotten that. And that's kind of given me the confidence to kind of keep going with my career. Because, you don't always write good stuff. Sometimes, you can be having a bad time at work, or a bad time with your girlfriend, or whatever, and you're not always in the best frame of mind to write some happy cartoon, la 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 la, la sort of music. You're not in that frame of mind, and sometimes you don't get it right, and there isn't any time to fix it. And this is the other thing. So you have to kind of pick yourself up from that and think, okay, well, look, let's keep going. Next project, hopefully I'll get it a bit better next time, and just keep trying, keep doing it. Because somebody else once said to me, your best track is the last track you've written. Every track you write, you get better. Just keep going, keep going, keep going. And eventually you'll start writing really good stuff. You know, it doesn't matter where you start from, just keep going. You know, and because you learn. Every track you write, you learn something new.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and kind of building off of that, this is probably more of an atypical question, but if somebody, and I don't know, I mean, why somebody would ask this, nobody probably will, but if somebody said, Nathan, can you just write one theme song for this pandemic? And not even saying, oh, it's going to be used in a documentary or it's going to be used in, you know, whatever, just theme for the pandemic. My question to you is kind of where would you start with that? What instruments would you imagine and what kind of chord structure would come to mind? So I have some ideas on my end. I'm curious what ideas you have.
Okay. So, well, with all these things, you know, and I have similar questions about, you know, games when I'm working on a game, you know, Lara goes to a jungle, you know, what are you going to write kind of thing. So,
Right.
You know, the things that immediately spring to my mind about your question is, you know, firstly, the virus, what does it look like? Secondly, what do people look like who have experienced it?
Mm-hmm.
And what do people look like who have experienced deaths in the family?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there has to be an element of fear. There has to be an element of sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, probably some weird genetics stuff going on.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a scary, scary thing. I would probably, you know, start out with something that would describe the virus. So, you know, perhaps some strings and something wiry.
Mm-hmm.
Strings, scratching piano strings or guitar strings or something that feels like something's cutting into you.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Right? And then, you know, move towards, you know, the fear of people, the fear on people's faces when they find out they've got it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that sort of wonder of whether they're going to stay alive or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that must be really frightening.
Yeah. That's number one reason I've been not, you know, I don't want to get it is because I don't want to deal with the anxiety of it. You know,
Right.
I had a nightmare a couple nights ago. I don't even remember what day it was, but I had a nightmare just that I had a fever. That's it.
Right.
It wasn't a nightmare that I was intubated or in the hospital dying. Just the thought of if I got a fever right now, would that be day one of the, you know what I mean? Just that thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's got to be something, you know, that's something that we haven't experienced, you know.
Yeah. And I think, you know, it's worse. The fear is greater now, having seen how many people have died. You know, if you get it now, it must be more frightening now than, say, at the beginning when you didn't really know,
Right.
know whether it was, you know,
right.
Oh, it's just another flu. You know, that's what they were saying at the beginning, wasn't it? It's like,
right.
Now it's like, well, we know it's not.
Well, people still say that here, unfortunately, but that's more of some of it is a denial mechanism, and that's a coping strategy in itself. That if we can, you know,
it's probably, you know, I would say it's probably just another flu if you're healthy and fit. But, you know, then there are people who seemingly have been perfectly healthy and fit, and it's killed them, and they've been young as well.
Right.
You know, and it's like, you know, you know,
right. That's the scary part. You know,
you don't really know. You don't really know how your body's going to react to it. I think this is the thing. You know, it's really down to you and whether you cope with it okay or not.
Right.
That's just down to your own genetics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, I think finally there has to be some melancholy in there. There's got to be some sadness, because I think a lot of people have experienced awful loss in the family, in which, you know, and it's dreadful.
Yeah. Yeah, I like where you're going with that. For me, I worked on a song that, so you can really recreate a sound. You can sort of communicate through sound. That's sort of what I did with this song. And the song was called Sounds of False Warmth. It's a different song than the tornado siren song I was telling you about. But when I was a really young kid, I used to sit by one of the heater vents in the house we lived in, and it would feel good at first, you know, for the first 5-10 minutes. But then when you're sitting real close, your skin starts to itch from the heat. And I was like, how can you capture that in a song? And the university I used to go to, they had this little foyer when you walk in one of the buildings, and there was this heater that they were heating the room. You know, there's just a room before you go into the actual building, and this heater had a very strangely, uniquely harmonic sound to it, and it was almost like making a chord. The fan motor in there was making a chord on its own. I've got to sample that, so I sampled it. I think maybe 15 seconds of it I sampled, and even though I didn't really do much in terms of processing that sample because it was so good on its own, it took me a lot of time to loop it properly so you couldn't tell that it was being looped.
Okay.
And that became the back of a song, but then I'm like, well, how do I put in the discomfort that it's good at first, but then how do I put in that discomfort when your skin starts to itch? And what I determined was distortion. And so I distorted a separate sample that I recorded. I think it was actually it was a mobile app. It was a Moog mobile app. I had an old version of Moog on the computer. I had several software since I was working with, and I had one on the mobile phone, and I recorded a sound on there, and then I brought it into Adobe Audition, and I distorted it, and then I panned it left to right. So you hear this fan sound coming in, this harmonic, calming fan, but then you start to hear this, and then the piano comes in, right? So it kind of escalates into that, and the song actually ends with some drums as everything else kind of fades out. And I kind of came back to that song in a sense because one of the ways that has been thought that people are very, I want to use the word innocently, like it's not, you know, it doesn't take somebody, oops, sorry, coughing in your face to get it, is people are going to maybe, you know, indoor dining restaurants if it's crowded and somebody, you know, at a table near you, even if it's more than 6 feet, it's getting caught into the air circulation system. And it's just sort of recirculating, and it kind of brought me back to that song of this idea of, you know, normally a event would be calming, but now there's this, you can have a horrible virus passing through it, you know? I would probably change that. The song itself wouldn't fit the context of it, the rest of it, but that piece could fit. And not that people they're not going to listen to that and know exactly, oh, well, that's Event when he's talking about that. No, you can't communicate like that. But the idea of through the sound, you create that.
Yeah, you communicate an emotion.
Right.
You know, with music and sound, this is what you're doing. You're installing emotions in the listener. You know, you can write a piece of music and you can guarantee your listener will feel happy. Or you can write a piece of music and you can guarantee your listener will feel sad.
Right.
And this has a lot to do with the physics of harmonies and their harmonics, notes and their harmonics, and whether they're vibrating evenly together or whether they're vibrating unevenly. So with a major chord, say a major triad, C, E, and G, the harmonics of those 3 notes all vibrate evenly. And when that sound hits your eardrum vibrates evenly. And that's comforting for your brain. When you play a minor chord, say a C, E flat, and a G, the E flat, the harmonics of that note vibrate unevenly with the C and the G. And this causes an irritation in the eardrum, which is sensed in the brain as pain. So you feel discomfort and you feel, I don't like this, you know.
Right.
And this is on a very basic level how you can communicate to somebody through music. You know, I can make you feel happy now, and they go, feels nice.
Right.
I can make you feel uncomfortable now, and it's like, oh yeah, and they do. And it's literally you're just patting their eardrum in a nice way or a nasty way, and it forces them to feel in a certain way. And when you stretch out that basic principle and start to work on storytelling and cadence resolving, where you kind of lead people to a sort of horrible ending, but then resolve it nicely. It's like, oh, you know, I thought this was going to be nasty, but I was pleasantly surprised. So this is how you start to tell a story, you know, or you can lead them down the garden path. Oh, this is lovely. And suddenly, oh, you know, shock, you know. So again, you can force fear and surprise in them the other way. And so the more you do that, the more you learn about storytelling in music. And literally, it is sending them on a journey, an emotional journey. That's what any good composer should be able to do.
And I think that what you've done with the soundtracks, again, going back to Tomb Raiders 1 through 3 and the Tomb Raider suite, you use that same tactic again there, because there's some original pieces in there. Where what most people think of as the Tomb Raider theme, right? The motif, you know, do, 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 do. To me, that's more of Laura's motif. To me, that represents Laura Croft in those themes, but you can take that same piece and you've used it outside of those themes too, and you've put it with different chords. If there's something experiencing sadness, or something experiencing a journey along the way. And a good example of that is, there's many examples, but one is the Tomb Raider 3 level end theme, which has been worked into a new piece of its own on the suite called She's Cool.
Oh yeah.
It has that motif that people would think of as the Tomb Raider theme motif, but really to me that just represents Laura Croft. But then you pair it with different chords, and if my listening's correct, it's kind of a sustained 4 chord as one of the chords that plays along with that motif. And originally it was a looped track that would play when you would complete a level. And to me, when I hear that, it kind of has that journey along the way feeling. Like it makes you feel like, wow, because Tomb Raider 3 was, for me, a very difficult game.
Yes, it was. I think the most difficult out of those first 3.
Yeah. So you kind of needed something that was, you know, where the Tomb Raider 2, the Tomb Raider 2 level end theme was more of a short, kind of celebratory piece, and it was string-based, very much like the Venice violin. But the Tomb Raider 3 one was a looped piece, but it had what to me sounds like a sustained 4. The motif with sustained 4 as the backing rather than the original chords.
Yes, that's correct. There's a synth pad underneath the Rhodes, which is playing. Ding,
right.
Ding, and there's a suspension, a 4 suspension, which does resolve about every 4 times. It resolves to the 3rd, and then it goes back to the suspension again. So yeah, I think, you know, the technique behind that is, you know, when it's a suspension, it hasn't finished. So although you've completed a level, there's still more to go, you know. Keep them on the suspension. So it's like, come on, where's the resolve? And every now and again, I just resolve it a bit, but then I go back again. So you kind of give this sense that, well, I've completed something, but I've still got a long journey to go.
Right. Absolutely.
That's what that piece does.
There are days where, you know, I'm at work and it's like, you know, sometimes I would stay really late in my classroom. I'm like, all right, I finished everything. It's 5:00 p.m., you know, and before I go, I'm just going to play that. before I shut the sound bar off and I'll play that. You know, it's like, this is my statistics, and I go through what I got done today. And that's like my level M statistics. It fits well. It fits well. You know, interestingly, I thought that anytime you think you have an original idea, you probably don't. That's just the way life works, at least a completely original idea. And somebody already beat me to the idea of Laura Croft with a mask on. Somebody did some artwork with that, but I'm like, oh wow, that was a cool concept, because I figured, I'm like, yeah, she would definitely wear the mask. I could see that. Could see that. And I think that, like, it would be interesting for her, like a stay-at-home order, stay at Croft Manor. That would be interesting. But she has the whole gym in there, so I guess.
You know, does she keep her distance from Winston, or what? Or does he follow her around, keeping 2 meters away?
He's probably still locked in the freezer. It's probably still locked in the freezer.
Probably the safest place to keep it. Yeah.
Probably the safest place. Well, we're out of time today, but Nathan, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. It's 5 a.m. here in Chicago time. What time is it there?
It's 12 o'clock lunchtime.
12 o'clock lunchtime. All righty. Well, thank you again so
You're
much.
welcome. No, thank you very much for having me on. It's been some great questions. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Excellent, excellent. Hang around for a second. I'll say goodbye to you properly. For everybody else, please share. If nothing else, share. And go ahead and press the like button too. And if you want to check out Nathan's work, we've been talking about the Tomb Raider Suite, which was music from the first 3 games that was redone with an actual orchestra. So you definitely want to look that up as well. And stay safe. Take care.